hadn't been back to the farm in years. My grandfather passed when I was in my 20s, and since then, the old place had been left to decay, standing on its own like a forgotten sentinel at the edge of the woods. I hadn't thought about it much, but now at 45 something called me back. Maybe it was nostalgia or maybe it was guilt. Either way, I found myself driving down that old gravel road, the one that led to the house where I'd spent so many summers as a kid. The barn was the first thing I saw as I rounded the bend. It loomed large, hunched over as if the weight of time had been pressing down on it for decades. The red paint was faded, peeling in long strips that exposed the weathered wood beneath. It had always been eerie even when I was a boy. My cousins and I used to dare each other to go inside, but none of us ever made it more than a few feet past the door. I parked the car and stepped out. The air was thick, humid, like a storm was on its way, but the sky was clear. I could feel something, an odd pressure, maybe, a subtle force that seemed to vibrate in the ground beneath my feet. The barn stood there in silence, watching me. I made my way up to the farmhouse first, pushing open the door that creaked like the house was protesting my arrival. Dust clouded the air, and everything was exactly as it had been left. The old wooden table, the rocking chair in the corner, the photograph of my grandfather on the mantel, his eyes watching me with that same intensity one remembered. But it wasn't the house that drew me. It was the barn. I stood in the doorway of the old structure, peering into the darkness beyond. The familiar smell of damp hay mixed with something different, something metallic. I hesitated before stepping inside. The air felt angry, like it was charged with a kind of aggression I couldn't explain. As I moved deeper into the barn, the shadows seemed to stretch and coil around me. There was a light seeping through the cracks in the walls, but it did nothing to make the space feel less ominous. Each creak of the floorboards under my feet echoed like the groan of some ancient creature stirring in its sleep. I reached the back of the barn, where an old tarp covered something large. My heart pounded as I pulled it back. Nothing. Just an old tractor, rusted and forgotten. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. And that's when I saw it. At the very end of the barn, near the old hangar doors, there were dark stains on the floor. Blood. Fresh. It trailed off toward the corner, disappearing into the shadows. I stood frozen, my mind racing but my body locked in place. That feeling, that suffocating anger in the air, it was stronger now, pulsing in rhythm with my heartbeat. A chill ran down my spine and I realized something I hadn't before. I wasn't alone in the barn. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and I heard the faintest sound, like a breath, or was it a growl? Something was watching me. My breath hitched in my throat as I stared at the blood stain on the floor. It was unmistakable, dark and glistening in the dim light filtering through the barn's cracked walls. I wasn't a squeamish man, but seeing fresh blood in a place that should have been abandoned for years sent an icy shiver through my bones. There was something wrong here. Deeply wrong. Yet, for reasons I couldn't explain, I found myself inching forward, curiosity overriding the instinct to turn around and leave. As I moved closer to the blood, my footsteps seemed unnaturally loud, each one crunching over the grit on the floor. The barn creaked as though it was alive, its old wooden frame groaning in protest. The closer I got to the end of the barn, the heavier the air felt, thick like it was soaked with anger. My heart thudded in my chest, loud enough that I was sure it could be heard echoing through the silent building. The blood trail was faint but undeniable, as though whatever had bled was dragged, or had dragged itself, towards the back corner of the barn. There, half hidden behind a stack of broken crates, I saw something that made my skin crawl. An iron trap. It was one of those old-fashioned hunting traps, the kind with thick metal jaws designed to snap shut with enough force to crush bone. My grandfather used to have a few of them scattered around the property to deal with coyotes or stray dogs that wandered too close to the livestock. But this one wasn't rusted or forgotten. It looked newer, recently set. And it was broken, snapped apart as if something had ripped it open with unnatural strength. I knelt down to get a closer look, my fingers hovering just above the mangled iron. The trap wasn't just broken, it was twisted, warped in ways that didn't make sense. The steel jaws were bent back as if something massive had pried them apart. I tried to imagine what kind of animal could have done this, but the thought didn't sit well in my mind. No bear or wolf could break a trap like this, not with its teeth or claws. And even if they could, what the hell would one be doing in an old barn like this? But it wasn't just the trap that disturbed me. There was blood. Fresh blood. Thick droplets still clung to the iron teeth, smeared across the dirt where the trap had been. I stared at the blood, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. It was a deep, crimson red, the kind that makes you realize it came from something very much alive. Something had been caught here. Something big. I stood up, backing away from the trap, my hands shaking. What had bled here? An animal? A person? I didn't know what scared me more, the idea that some wild animal had torn through this place or the idea that it might have been something else. Something unnatural. As I turned to leave, my boot caught on something heavy, nearly tripping me. I stumbled, catching myself on the rough barn wall. Looking down, I saw another iron trap, this one older and rusted, half buried in the dirt. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, and yet, my mind wouldn't let go of the broken one behind me. I walked slowly now, my senses heightened, taking in every detail of the barn. There were strange markings on the walls, barely noticeable in the dim light. Long scratches, deep and jagged, as if something with claws had tried to escape or break in. The wooden beams overhead creaked, as if something heavy had once swung from them. I couldn't shake the feeling that this place had seen violence, had witnessed something terrible. A gust of wind howled through the barn, rattling the old doors and sending a chill up my spine. The sounds outside were muted, as though the world beyond the walls had retreated, leaving only this place, suspended in some kind of eerie, timeless stillness. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and fast, the only sign that time hadn't stopped altogether. I approached the barn doors slowly, my gaze lingering on the far end where the trap lay broken and bloody. The hangar doors stood partially open, just enough for a man, or something larger, to slip through. As I reached out to touch the door, my hand froze. There was something on the floor, just at the threshold, where the light from outside mixed with the darkness inside. More blood. It was smeared along the ground, like something had been dragged out of the barn. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and crouched down to inspect it. The trail led out, beyond the barn, toward the woods that encircled the property. The blood was fresh, still glistening in the fading daylight. I could almost feel the warmth of it as my fingers hovered just above the ground. I straightened up and looked back into the barn. Something was wrong here, something far beyond my understanding. I had no business being here, poking around like some clueless detective in a horror movie. My grandfather's old farm had always had its mysteries, stories of animals disappearing, strange noises at night, but this was different. This was real. Tangible. Yet, despite the gnawing fear in my gut, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had to keep looking. The trap, the blood, the angry, oppressive atmosphere, it was like the barn was daring me to uncover whatever secrets it held. I had come here looking for memories, for closure. What I'd found was something darker, something that didn't want to be discovered. But now that I'd started, I wasn't sure I could stop. The barn creaked again, the sound like a groan of something old and furious. I stepped back, my eyes still fixed on that broken trap, wondering just what kind of nightmare I had walked into. I backed away from the barn slowly, my mind still racing over the sight of that broken trap and the blood. It was clear now that I was dealing with something far beyond the typical stray animals my grandfather might have trapped all those years ago. My legs felt weak, but I managed to force myself back toward the farmhouse, my gaze constantly darting back toward the barn as though something might lunge out of the shadows at any moment. As I stepped outside, the evening sun was already beginning to sink behind the distant treetops, casting long shadows across the overgrown grass. The air was thick with humidity, clinging to my skin like a second layer. I could hear the faint hum of crickets starting up, the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. I quickened my pace, not wanting to linger too long in the open, exposed between the barn and the house. Every step felt heavier, like the atmosphere was pressing down harder, angrier. The closer I got to the house, the more I convinced myself I had to leave. Forget about the blood. Forget about the barn. I could pack up, head to a motel in town, and pretend none of this ever happened. But as I reached the porch, something caught my eye. 2 glowing orbs. At first, they seemed like distant reflections, maybe from the last rays of sunlight glinting off something metallic. But as I squinted, my heart pounding in my chest, I realized they were moving, slowly, deliberately. They were watching me. My breath caught in my throat. The eyes were too far apart to belong to a person, too high off the ground. I squinted, the hair on the back of my neck prickling as I tried to make sense of the shape behind the eyes. It was massive, dark against the encroaching twilight, standing still as a statue just at the edge of the treeline near the house. Then it moved, a subtle shift in weight, and I saw the outline more clearly. It wasn't human. Not even close. It was a moose. An enormous one. The creature's head turned slightly, and the eyes flickered as it took a step toward me. I could see its large, flat antlers spreading out like a crown of twisted branches. But something was wrong. Even from this distance, I could see its gait was uneven, its movements labored. My eyes dropped to its leg. Blood. Dark and fresh. The same blood I'd seen in the barn. The animal's hind leg was wounded, badly. A deep gash ran along its side, and its fur was matted with blood. It was limping, dragging its leg through the grass with each step, and I realized with a sickening clarity that this was the creature that had torn itself free from the trap. The moose didn't move like a normal animal. It seemed agitated, unnaturally so. Its chest heaved with heavy, ragged breaths, and its eyes, those terrible, glowing eyes, were locked on me with an intensity that sent my heart racing. I took a step back, but I couldn't tear my gaze away. The moose was watching me, its nostrils flaring, and for a moment, we stood there, frozen in the quiet tension of the evening. And then it charged. It happened so fast I barely had time to react. The beast let out a deep, guttural bellow, lowering its head as it barreled toward me with surprising speed. My instincts kicked in and I stumbled backward, my legs moving before my mind could process what was happening. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the uneven ground as I bolted toward the house. But I knew I wasn't fast enough. The moose hit me like a freight train. Its antlers caught me in the side, lifting me off the ground as easily as if I were weightless. The impact knocked the air out of my lungs and I felt a sharp, searing pain shoot through my ribs as I flew backward, landing hard on the ground several feet away. The world spun around me and my vision blurred. I tried to scream but no sound came out, just a breathless gasp as my body crumpled beneath the force of the blow. I hit the ground hard, the breath knocked out of me, the taste of dirt and blood in my mouth. I tried to crawl, tried to get to my feet, but before I could even register the thought, the moose was on me again, its massive hooves stomping the ground near my head. I rolled over, half blind with pain, just in time to see the dark silhouette of the animal looming over me, its hot breath washing over my face in ragged bursts. Its eyes, those damned eyes, were filled with rage, wild and unfocused as it raised its head again, preparing for another strike. I braced myself, squeezing my eyes shut, waiting for the final blow. But it didn't come. Instead, the moose staggered, letting out a low, pained groan, its injured leg buckling beneath it. It stumbled to the side, and in the chaos, I somehow managed to crawl out of its path, dragging myself toward the house as my vision swam. My body screamed in protest with every movement, but I kept going, knowing that if I stopped, I might never get up again. Then everything went black. I woke up to the sound of someone calling my name. At first, it was faint, like a voice coming from far away. I blinked, squinting against the morning light that streamed through the trees. My head throbbed and my body felt heavy, bruised. I tried to move, but pain shot through my ribs, forcing me to lie still. "Hey, you all right? Can you hear me?" I turned my head slowly and saw a man standing over me. He was dressed in worn flannel, with a scruffy beard and a weathered face, someone I didn't recognize at first, but his clothes, the orange vest, the rifle slung over his shoulder, he was a forester or a hunter. His face was a mixture of concern and relief as he knelt beside me. "I've been tracking that damn moose for days," he said, his voice low, gravelly. "You're lucky to be alive." The memory of the moose charging at me hit like a tidal wave, and I winced, instinctively reaching for my side where the antlers had slammed into me. What happened?" I croaked, my throat dry, my voice barely more than a whisper. The man shook his head, glancing over his shoulder toward the barn. "I found you out here, unconscious. That moose, it's a big one, biggest I've ever seen. It was limping when I caught sight of it, bleeding bad from the leg. Saw you lying here and thought for sure you were a goner." I winced as I slowly pushed myself into a sitting position, my head spinning. "Did you catch it?" The forester nodded, his expression grim. "Yeah. Managed to track it down after it knocked you out. Got it right before it could charge again. You helped more than you know, bleeding like that, the thing was bound to go down sooner or later." He offered me a hand, helping me to my feet. Every muscle in my body protested, but I stood, wincing as I pressed a hand to my ribs. The forester pointed toward the edge of the woods and I followed his gaze. There, lying in the tall grass just beyond the treeline, was the moose. Even from this distance I could tell how massive it was, easily the largest animal I had ever seen. Its body was still, its fur matted with dried blood, the once ferocious eyes now dull and lifeless. The wound on its leg was deep, torn apart by the trap I'd found in the barn. "I've been hunting a long time," the forester muttered, "but I've never seen a moose like that before." It was as if something was driving it mad. He paused, his eyes narrowing. "You should be careful around here. This land, it has a way of bringing out the worst in things." I glanced back at the barn, the weight of his words settling in my chest. The memories of the blood, the trap, and the violent charge flooded back all at once. Something about this place wasn't right. Something had driven that moose to madness. And I had a feeling it wasn't over yet.